is starting now. Do you all see the recording? Yes, we can get started, Roman.
Okay, thank you, Savita. And thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon. I'm Roman McAllen. I'm the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Houston. And today we're holding this meeting. Let me make sure I'm on the right. Did I have the right slide up for you guys right here? This is a meeting of February 1st of the Conservation District Focus Group. Our agenda today is, we hope this is the goal that we've sort of set, and that is to review the survey results and begin a very initial pass at a draft recommendation narrative for a conservation district ordinance. And so item 1 is to review the survey results. 2, a little bit of going over some of the few things we've talked about and wanting to have accomplished. And 3, begin that narrative together. So with that, I'm going to share a different screen, which has those results. I'm sorry we didn't have time to transfer it over to PDF. At this moment, I'm hoping you'll see mostly a white page with a bar graph, and it says Q1. Is that working? Is that showing up?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
it's showing up. Thanks.
So so the questions we put out there, we had 7 responses of the 9 members of the focus group. And on question 1, upper right hand side above those bars, it says who should be able to initiate a conservation district's creation. Select all that apply or fill in any other option. And by the way, I want to introduce Amanda Coleman, who's on the staff here from the Preservation Office, and she helped to she put together these results along with the Excel kind of spreadsheet below, so you could see them in 2 ways, and the summary to the left. So we see that everyone agrees that property owners, the tallest bar there, is that property owners should be able to initiate a district creation. And then most people agreed that an HOA should be able to initiate one. And I feel like that on the HOA question, I initially read that in my mind as a civic club, but of course they are not the same thing. So I wanted to, this is an open discussion, if you will, with you guys, with everybody. When those 5 people who said HOA, I'm thinking to myself that the districts that we have, the historic districts that we have, that I know of, don't have HOAs. So if I could imagine particular neighborhoods in Houston that may not have one, could that question, if we had said HOAs or civic clubs or something like that, would you have felt the same way about that? We know, like for the Nor Hill Civic Association is very active, and there are, in a way, it's kind of covered regardless, because by saying that property owners should be able to create them, you're not limiting property owners to acting just individually. They could be acting obviously through the group, through a civic club, if I understand it correctly. Any thoughts on that? If not,
this is Curtis Davis. I think civic clubs and homeowners associations have different missions, although they have overlapping activities. And I would recommend that they both be considered, but they are both different in some fundamental ways. As it relates to conservation district and their fundamental missions, I think to the extent that the homeowners association may theoretically be more focused on value maintenance in the property and specific amenities associated with maintaining the value in the properties. Their interest in that conservation district development could be more intense. On a cultural basis, when you're talking beyond value, particularly in communities that don't have high home ownership, the question of cultural maintenance, particularly those neighborhoods that have been chronically disinvested, may have a slightly different perspective on why one would want to introduce a conservation district. So the purposes and the drivers may differ depending on the population you're dealing with. And the civic associations and the homeowners associations are equally relevant, but may have different motivations. So when you put together the legislation, that would need to be considered.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Davidson. I'm sorry, I know you're a member of the task force as well. Thank you. Okay, so the next category that people felt supportive of is that the city council, 4 of the 7 felt that city council should be able to initiate a conservation district creation. And to a lesser extent, residents and then staff and the HHC and the TERS got 3 votes each. Yes.
His hand raised, Roman.
I'm sorry. Absolutely. Whose hand is raised? Sandy Stevens. Thank you. Go ahead.
Peter Friedman and Peter Friedman.
Oh, Peter Friedman. Sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Friedman.
Thanks, Roman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
So I did not put in the HOA just for the reason that the HOA has several of these powers already in its charter to kind of design and conform homes. And secondly, an HOA for the most part is run by the board of directors. And I was kind of concerned that you'd have a board of directors that wanted to go in one way without true agreement from the property owners. So I had voted for the property owners as the option, not with the HOA, just because, like I said, they had some sort of powers already entrained in the HOA. And then secondly, it's sometimes a board of directors does not have the full community's agreement on certain things they're moving forward with.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Yes, that
Ms.
makes
Stevens?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up to what Mr. Davis just said. I do think that there are a number of neighborhoods without homeowners associations, but kind of come together under civic clubs, and it's not always the property owners. I think he referenced cultural history, but the residents who are living within the neighborhood. And certainly I understand that property owners will be the drivers for these kinds of efforts, but I do think civic clubs are good organizations to work in injunction with other organizations. And I do agree that HOAs certainly have a different focus than do civic clubs, and that's why I think that civic clubs should be included.
Okay. Am I hearing then that, or would, based on Mr. Friedman's comments and Mr. Davidson, what you're saying, is it? Well, we still had 5 people say, oh, again, is it? If we were just listing, imagine ourselves writing this ordinance, that it may state that applications for conservation districts may be initiated by, and we start to make that list. You as the task force, are you comfortable with us listing all of these, although we didn't get buy-in from y'all on all of them? Or should we just take the top 3 or 4? And we kind of run into a trouble because the voting numbers. We know that the property owners should be able to initiate. We know that the number 5 again is the homeowners. Sorry, I'm a little colorblind. I have to keep the homeowners association, and then 4 is city council. The TERS certainly makes sense to me too. There could come that, But I feel like this generally should come from property owners. Though they're the people, this tool seems like it's going to be something grabbed upon by people interested really in a lot in cultural maintenance and a lot of preservation of their communities. And I know we've got a hand up here too. And I'm sorry, but I don't see whose hand that is. Oh, Meg, I'm sorry. Ms. Lousteau, would you like to say something?
Sure. I appreciate that there are various reasons that groups might want to initiate a conservation association. I'm just curious as to the people who voted for property owners being able to initiate, but didn't vote for residents to be able to initiate. As I understand it, the initiation would not mean that it would actually come to pass. It would just be the start of something. So I would love to understand better why there are people who are thinking that allowing that residents who are not necessarily property owners, like what the drawback is.
Yes. Any thoughts on that? We have 3 people vote for the residents, and that's a good point, that this is just initiation. And, in the case of historic districts, you initiate an application, but it isn't even sometimes reaching the complete status. So it depends how the wording of the so-called enabling legislation here for conservation works out. But that's a good point. Especially if we're talking about affordability, which I know the task force is very interested in affordability and maintaining affordability. And then maybe it's tenants that don't have ownership that are trying to accomplish some protections.
If I could just follow up really quickly, Roman, I think that speaks to what Mr. Davis referenced earlier about the traditional means of defining, what matters in terms of preservation may not be as available to certain groups of people, particularly those who are not economically empowered enough to be property owners. So I clearly voted for residents to be able to have this opportunity to initiate the discussion. Perhaps even if the majority of property owners weren't on board at the time of initiation, this process would enable the residents and other groups educate people, property owners, as to why it matters, positive for the neighborhood.
Thank you. And I failed to note that if you, again, coming back to the page I have before you in the lower right-hand corner, 2 people put in others, and they said some groups to review and give a recommendation to City Council after the property owners have made the initial petition. And another person said management districts and others authorized to manage or steward a district or an area like a conservancy. And Mr. Davis, did you have a comment?
Yes. My point was that one stake in a community is not necessarily just an economic stake or an ownership stake. And I think there is a tradition in many cities of recognizing property ownership rights as a leading indicator for other rights and privileges in decision-making in the city context. And I think it's an important one, particularly when it talks about an economic interest, but there are also social cultural interests that citizens have and that they also have a stake in. And the economic interest ought not be the only driver for public policy. That's the point that I'm trying to make clear. So that if one is a lifetime renter in a neighborhood, one's interest in the quality of that neighborhood in all of its dimensions is as relevant as the lifetime homeowner's interest is in that neighborhood. So it's a conceptual way of thinking about the city and how we build the city and define the city. If this was a ranch land with 5-acre lots for everyone, it might be a bit different, but we're talking of sizes of individual lots for a home of less than half an acre. And so that density and that proximity brings in other interests in a more intense way. So that just on that level alone, one needs to begin to think about these things a bit different. But that doesn't mean that you diminish the interest of the property owner, because I think that's still very important for a variety of reasons around economic concerns. But the city is built for purposes other than just economic purposes. So that's why I'm making the point and trying to get people to focus on residents as the driver, but not diminish necessarily the homeowner as a major stakeholder.
I think I understand that. And it makes me think about some of the housing projects where we have a few large housing complexes. I'm talking about, like on Allen Parkway and the one near Texas Southern, and those long-term residents there should be considered and have some impact, be able to have an impact.
And the issue extends to the rental market. There's a growing market of single-family houses that are being rented right now, and I think different communities have issues around student housing. Okay, students are very active and say that their tenancy is short. When I was a student in college in Houston years ago at Rice, the Montrose area was full of students, and they had a very strong interest. The gay community in that neighborhood had a major impact on the cultural impact of the life of the city, and many of those folks were renters. So my point is that the character of the city and the things that impact the character of the city, of which this is a major activity, ought to think about what drives the process in dimensions other than just economic dimensions. It kind of fundamentally challenges us to think a little bit different about this. And it's not just poor and rich, black and white. It's really in this case, whether the property is an investment or a commodity, whether it's a service or an asset. And if you start looking at the property only in those terms, you begin to overlook some major issues as it relates to cultural heritage and maintenance in the city. That's why, I would postulate that's one of the reasons Houston is such an etch-a-sketch city when it comes to its architecture.
Roman, this
is
Sabrina.
Yes.
We have a comment in the chat asking a question about how about Super Neighborhood Alliance? Should they be able to initiate an application? This question is for the committee focus group members.
Oh, thank you. Thoughts on that question, please?
I would argue certainly, if based on the arguments that I just made earlier.
I think you're right. Okay, let's go on. Oh wait, Peter Friedman, Mr. Friedman.
Yeah, the idea of the super neighborhood is kind of interesting because it does take up a very large area. So I think it would really depend on how specific we want to make an area, a district area. If it's a large scale area, I think a super neighborhood's definitely a good idea. If you're trying to get into more block by block, I think that would be kind of overstretching. Also, I think following up on Mr. Davis's comments about having renters have a position here for input, I think on starting the application process, I think that's a great idea. I think everybody that's a resident there should be part of that process. But my concern would be if it gets to a point where it is going to be voted on and there's an economic impact to those owners, should the renters be involved at that point? Because they're voting on something that definitely impacts them in their area and what their neighborhood is like, but it doesn't actually impact them economically.
I think it's a fair point when it comes to the decision making. The economic status quo has to be recognized. It can't be ignored, even though we might desire a city not to have rentals as commodities. the fact of the matter is that people do have an economic interest. Renters have an economic interest as well. It's just different from that of the property owner. But when you get down to the actual execution of a vote, it is going to be a challenge to think about it. And I would say that the ownership position has to be recognized, whether it's preeminent or whether it's the only interest or the dominant interest is, I think, a question that we could consider later. But in terms of the mechanisms for actually making the decision.
Along that line, I think it's a good time for me to bring up something. The director and I were discussing the percentage of people, the question which we did not put into this survey, but ultimately will come up, and that is what percentage of acceptance, or what's the word, opting in, that's not the right word, but yeah, I guess it's along those lines. What percentage of property owners should be required in order to approve a district? In the case of historic districts, for example, it's 67%. In some places, it's 51% or something like that. To what you're saying, Mr. Friedman and Mr. Davis, what I suggested is perhaps, and maybe this will help with that question about the owners, is that we have sort of a tiered adoption in the ordinance, allowing it, for example, the more you're regulating the land in terms of, like, for example, setbacks, demolition, lot coverage, or whatever, as the things you're regulating go up, the more owner buy-in is required. Whereas the less you're actually regulating the land, but then it can be less buy-in. For example, the question is about demolitions. For a lot of people, there may be opposition to requiring demolitions to go before get approval, either from the commission or from staff. And maybe that if you're proposing a conservation district whereby you're going to regulate the demolition of historic structures, that you need a higher buy-in. Whereas if it's we would have to, when we look at our later on, we have the question about what you want to regulate. But that's an idea that maybe a tiered system could work. If we don't mind, I'll go to the next page just to keep moving along here. I'm going to go over here, and this should go. Do you see a question? That should not be 3. That should be 2. So 2 was, what criteria should be considered to establish a conservation district? Select all that apply. Everyone agreed that possessing character, architectural style, or type of building is important to the neighborhood or city. Boy, I'm colorblind. This helps me. Significant architectural sites, archaeological sites. Is that the next number 7? Someone whose eyes work better.
Cultural significance.
That's a cultural significance, important to the community. Excellent, because that's right where we're thinking about. And then 6 is common streetscapes, vistas, vegetation, or building form and massing. And 5, common architectural style, which is there. And then 4, significant architectural sites. It looks like we have more agreement here that we have a lot of flexibility in and we're suggesting a lot of flexibility here. I think this is consensus. We kind of have consensus here. Any thoughts on this topic? Not all. Go to 3. 3 was, what is the minimum number of properties or lots that constitute a conservation district? That may constitute is what we meant to ask here. And we've got 2 people said 3 lots. 2 people said 10 lots. 3 people said by continuous block face. And then we have 2 others. One person noted that one city block or a continuous block face with the same number of lots as existing single-family residential block, as a single-family residential block. And the other one is a single block face is a good measure, but a corner or large lot could have significance to help establish a district and establish rules to keep it intact and not subdivide it. So we've got a wide, you know, a wider group of answers. So I was trying to figure this out, where to go. If we were going to make a recommendation as staff in the adoption of an ordinance, where's the consensus here? For me, I'd always said two or more, and I have the reasoning in my head on the two or more was simply that I feel like there could be significant resources that are on odd shaped or large lots, or even different ways that it could come into play. But I appreciate it doesn't 3 or more, 10. Yeah, I'm very flexible here. I just think it should be a tool that is, I think about the difficulty in getting. So let's say, for example, go back to that tiered system of adoption, and there is a little enclave left in a particular neighborhood of original historic resources and a group of owners who really want to protect them, or residents, as we said, that really want to protect them. And if we say they want to regulate demolition, therefore maybe that's creating that higher bar of acceptance of the district. Maybe it's 67%, just like a historic district. Then the larger you make the minimum, the harder it is for those individuals to get that percentage of acceptance. Mr. Davis?
Again, I would just think about it from a conceptual level, because from an architectural or urban planning level, it's very difficult to say whether one would be problematic. So I thought about what is the one that one could imagine, and that would be a cemetery, right? If it's a single cemetery and you wanted that cemetery to be a conservation district in a neighborhood, because the neighborhood felt that it drove the character in some way or another, then how would that logically play out? So that argued for one. When I get into thinking about residential property itself, gosh, the permutations are just all over the place. And so in one neighborhood, 1 or 2 lots would really, really matter. And in another neighborhood, it wouldn't matter at all. So if I looked at Sunnyside, is there a spot that I can imagine and visualize in Sunnyside where 1 lot would drive and matter? And I can't think of one right off the top of my head, whereas I can think of 2 or 3 in the 5th ward and in the 3rd ward. So it is, it's kind of place specific as to determine whether that would be okay. So that's why I kind of default to say, well, 1 lot, if you use the model of a cemetery being a place that you want to make a conservation district.
Thank you. Any thoughts about that? So that's even the 1 lot, but that's along the lines of what I was thinking. That it always depends on that. Ms. Lusteau?
Yes, I would tend to agree again with Mr. Davis. If we're trying to offer maximum flexibility as to how a conservation district might be applied to various neighborhoods, then I don't necessarily see a downside to having a very small minimum number in order to initiate a creation of one. But I'm very open to the reasons that there might be downsides. So I'll turn my mic off and listen.
Would someone who put 10 respond to that? Someone who answered 10 or more lots? Have we convinced you otherwise, or is there a thought to why it needs to be a larger number? So Meg's hand is up. Any other hands?
Roman, may I ask a question to the
Sure.
group members?
Sure.
It's an interesting perspective to see that, to learn that 1 lot could also request an application to become a conservation district. In my mind, when I hear district, I'm thinking an area. A smaller area could be one of it. But okay, if we make 1 property do the conservation districts, ultimately when the district is established, will it have only 1 property? Or is it just for the initiation we are saying 1 property is okay?
I would argue that for the initiation, one property would be okay. And I think once you get into the process of determining what the district's purpose is and functionality and how it is maintained, again, I'll use the cemetery as an example. If the cemetery is bounded by parcels that currently have a certain character and density, one might logically argue that in order to maintain that, certain rules and regulations would have to apply to those surrounding properties, and they'd have to have a vote on it. But to initiate the discussion and initiate the consideration, the one property could be sufficient. So that's just kind of logically thinking it through, and to say, why would it be a district if it's going to, it would have to have some impacts beyond that one lot. And if I use the cemetery example again, the question is, what's maintaining the character of that cemetery outside of its property line? And it would be, well, you have to do certain kinds of things to maintain it within the property line, and for the abutting properties or whatever you decide when you're designing the district, then that would have impact on others, and those others should have a say. So that's kind of the logic that I would follow with it.
Thank you. I agree with that thought process. Maggie Lusto has her hand raised, followed by Peter Friedman.
I don't think my hand is still raised. Sorry if it is.
Oh, okay. Then Peter Friedman, please.
I was one of the people that put the continuous block face, and it was more just an idea of a continuous strip when I put that in there, or even kind of an equivalent number of lots. But I on the downside, I would see if we went one or three or a smaller number, if we started to get, say, 10, 20, 30 of these conservation districts of these smaller entities, it might be tough to manage it. You're talking about an area where you could have hundreds of these eventually, and it could be very unwieldy to kind of manage and control. The other part is on the smaller numbers, there's things you can do with deed restrictions, and if you're talking about a single lot or maybe a couple, that owners could get together and already kind of implement, hey, let's go ahead and put these restrictions on our property so they can't be developed in the future in any certain way. But that's just my kind of 2 cents on it.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you. Tough to manage, right? 20 or 30, where in that 20, if you have 20, they all got different requirements. Well, it took Houston a couple decades to get 22 historic districts. That might not be I could imagine that happening, but I doubt it would happen. But Mr. Davis, would you said in the Fifth Ward, one might matter, whereas in the Sunnyside, one might not. And I visualize that, like if I think about Sunnyside and the neighborhoods and the houses, I can't articulate why I know what that is, but could you talk a little bit more about how it could be that you might make
it had to do with a sense of density, and I think the point that just made about the manageability of it is a really fair point, and that's why I think there are limitations when we just say it has to be an arbitrary number, minimum lot number, and because if you go to some very small number of lots and you're talking in terms of districts, then the question of abutting conditions really, really matters, other than just a deed restriction, which would affect just the conditions on that lot. And that would be, in my mind, the distinction between why you would have deed restrictions versus a conservation district. And a single property could be considered as a district if the property, in order to maintain its character, requires some level of compliance or collaboration with adjacent properties, so that the notion of the conservation district is, or its boundaries are developed organically inside out, rather than determinatively outside in. So rather than say one must have a minimum of 10 and everything within that 10 becomes a district, the effect of the district and what it means could be generated from a very small element, a church, for example, that might physically have a major impact. I can think of scads of places in New England where a particular church and its siting defines the surrounding area, and people comply with how they maintain the area by a sense of social standards or agreement to maintain character and value and all that kind of good stuff. And so I think it needs to not just be a kind of a regulatory formulaic. Well, it has to have some kind of rigor, but my logic about thinking about one lot is if that lot has some kind of characteristic that it applies, people agree, there are impacts, and then if those who are affected by those impacts are involved and there's a dialogue, you bring that in. The other question about manageability is always a question, and I think that that's a valid one. I don't have an answer for that other than maybe you create a pipeline and say you can only have so many in a pipeline at any given time. Like if the constraint is a resource constraint.
Okay. And I just realized that I could see now when you mentioned the cemetery, I was thinking, well, why wouldn't you just landmark it? Or maybe the cemetery is any one of these singular examples. Why not landmark it? Well, the fact is, if this passes the way we're talking about it, and what we've studied and learned here is that the conservation districts are often, the permitting is often just at the staff level. So certificate of appropriateness doesn't go before the historical commission. It's just reviewed by staff. And I could see where someone would have a historic resource or a significant site or a cultural resource that they want to have protected in some way, but they're comfortable with the City of Houston's Office of Preservation being the review body, the staff. So I could see where that would come into play. I'll move on to the next question. Is question 4. Unless there was anything there, happy to go back if anyone said, should there be a maximum size for the district? Summary we've got was no maximum sizes. Everybody almost, well, someone said 4 blocks, and someone said it's hard to define. In discussing this with among ourselves as staff at one point, I made the comment along the lines of, if you're talking about a cultural district, it seems to me that the boundaries of that would be defined by the community and that significant. So it seems like that does need to be pretty flexible. So we have consensus there. I think we'll just go to the next one. 5. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one quick point on that. I think, for example, there is being proposed now an African American historic settlements trail. And so if there are a series of communities that are culturally connected, they might be considered a district, or one can think about a bayou, and so those linear kinds of things. So there is an argument of talking about an unlimited boundary. I think when we put in these arbitrary boundaries, it gets to be, in my mind, a little bit more difficult than to regulate it from the point of view of what comes through the door, and then to query it as to its relevance as a conservation district, why one would want to have it as a conservation district, and the argument would need to be made by the proponent as to why that's relevant. So, if one says this is a historic parade route, so therefore one ought to make a district because we've always had this historic parade that ran through these 12 neighborhoods, and that whole linear path needs to be a district, then they need to make the case, and those in those communities affected would have to concur.
Mr. Friedman?
I completely agree. It could be as big as necessary. I put 4 blocks in there, not because I thought 4 blocks should be the maximum size. I thought when voting on it, it'd be easier if it was broken up into smaller chunks. So you'd have more direct community in that exact area really involved. Um, I think Mr. Davis made a great point. If you got something that has a wide swath, then it'd be great to be able to run it all the way through. But I was thinking more along the lines on when you're going through the process of creating it, you could do it at a smaller chunk so you could really have that local involvement just in that area.
I see. So it's more about the adoption process and making sure you have the more intense involvement by breaking up the district.
Absolutely. And I'll give an example. The CDC I work for owns a lot of lots. That would give us a lot of voting power. So if you're going in, say, the greater OST South Union area, there's several groups that have a lot of land locked up here. So if you were kind of doing it in a smaller group, I think you could limit some of that, some of those larger entities having full control over an area or an uneven amount of control.
Okay, Mr. Garza.
Yes, if you don't mind, just a thought. When we're doing, minimum lot size and setbacks, one of the things is that we find that, the ordinance has changed so that a single block face can now apply, which kind of lends itself to what you're talking about in conservation districts. The unfortunate thing is that there's no way to add on. In other words, it's your block stands alone, and then the next block says, well, that was great. Let's do that ourselves. Perhaps there might be an opportunity to start a conservation district when it's initiated very, very small, and then allow the district, because this is all volunteer, might be able to join the district versus having 22, 40, 30, 100 conservation districts. We continue to add to a district and increase its size as people meet the criterion or get the votes or whatever is required. And that's something that the city is not doing today. That, as I said, when you have volunteers and they see the benefits of being in a conservation district like they do some of the other ordinances, they want to join and are willing to do the work after they see the initiative, after the initiative has been taken by others. So something to consider might be, again, that we allow conservation districts to grow as instead of being static and being locked into place. Just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an important one. Thank you. And that kind of flexible growth, again, it didn't come up in the questionnaire, but it'll come up when we review. When someone had mentioned the sunset review, those two kind of go together. That it's about that flexibility of the created entity, I think. So we were here. I think we were going to go to question 5. Question 5, we have it on 2 pages here. Question 5 was, which of these common regulatory tools should be available to neighbors desiring conservation districts? And this list is intended to be a broader menu that a community could choose from to tailor the district to their particular needs. And we have it in bar graph form here. A lot of consensus. Really, it looks like a lot of things are covered. I don't know. My color blindness makes me not want to read these. Amanda, could you do these in a reverse order of popularity here? Or we can.
You could flip to the next slide if you don't mind.
There we go. There we go. There we go. Okay, thank you. That's great. Thank you. So here we can again see it. 3 members felt that demolition could be a tool that people could select from. 5 people minimum lot size, 5 people lot width, 4 people lot depth, 3 people lot coverage or impervious surfaces, 5 landscape preservation, vegetation, old growth trees, 5 for front setbacks, 4 for side setbacks, 4 for rear setbacks, 4 for building height, 5 for massing, 4 for driveways, 5 for walkways and side steps, 5 for architectural style, 4 for fencing, which is interesting, which we don't regulate in the preservation office, and two others. One of them is they should have no regulatory tool application, but should have the use of all to incentivize compliance. And then we have another other, which was these are all great tools, but as previously discussed, they can also keep people from redeveloping and investing in the neighborhood. They should be tools to help people add to the character of the place, but not prevent that development. And if someone could mute here, or I might mute you, if you don't mind, mute a phone number there. If you're on 0575, I muted you on 0575 phone number, but all you do is *6, I think, to unmute. Again, let's see. So that's reviewing that. And again, there it is in bar form. And here it is here. I think we should just open this up. This is a real critical part of the discussion. This is a really critical part. And I would leave in my mind, I definitely think when we hear about cultural districts these days, or for example, the example that Mr. Davis provided about an African-American settlements trail, for example, I could see where you're making a conservation district that might not even pick up any of these particular requirements, but that the district in some other way is seeking protection. Although it's covered here of the streetscape, where we've got it in here, but I think of the bricks in Friedman's town, where the mayor, I believe, had to step in and really provide some protection there in a very direct way. But could a community of people apply for some protection of something like that? So any thoughts on any of these items or this topic of what to regulate? In particular, on the incentives, anybody thought of the incentives? I mean, incentives are critical, right? We know we heard, and we'll cover this in a few minutes, but we heard that we want to incentivize affordability. And there's all this talk about the missing middle. And what we know from the National Trust and the presentation that they made in their recent national conference on conservation districts is that people are using them to help with affordability. And so it is something that incentives matter. Now, in the adoption at this point, I don't think we would have in our narrative. Now, I'll be corrected by y'all, but we're seeking to be able to have this tool to be able to create the conservation district. I think the incentives may follow if we're successful in the future adoption of conservation ordinances and associated programming and programs. Go ahead, Mr. Davis, please.
Yeah, I think if you are requiring something, let's just say fencing, and you require a certain type of fence for new development or redoing your fence, then the incentives for that would be making available, low interest loan to be able to do it for that district. So it may be a relationship between community development block grant or TERS or somebody's resources to help facilitate the ability of a property owner to comply with what is being asked for in the district. And if you can't have that support, then that becomes burdensome for that property owner. But in terms of the actual requirement, like demolition, that gets to be fairly tricky. That is, if you're saying that you're prohibited from demolishing a certain type of property, and the property for whatever reason is uneconomic, and that the only alternative is demolition, then the question is, should that be allowed if a person can make the case, and is that economic imperative part of the part of the logic of structuring the district. I don't have an answer to that, but I can certainly say that if I owned a property and I got an offer to sell it and the buyer's intent was to tear down a single family house and build a quad, and that quad fit the character of the neighborhood, but it was different than what was in the district, that would be a challenge.
Ms. Escobar, please.
Sure thing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. I actually I want to acknowledge what Carl Davis just said. Curtis, excuse me. I don't know why I said Carl. I think that there are challenges that are going to come about when you have such a wide range of items that are being regulated. What have you all done in the past where these things are present so that they are checked and they are acknowledged so that they're not egregiously, left or right of some standard that's created, but there's allowed a path for variance, because I think it's obvious that there's going to be 100 different situations where you don't want to demolish, or you actually do want to demolish, and that actually is beneficial. Not every structure is historic, right? And not everything should be protected from demolition once it's reached the end of its life. So what tools does the planning department currently use so that not all of these things are restrictions to development? Like, how does the variance process normally work for these?
Thank you, Ms. Escobar. I think I could use some help on that question, because it makes me think of the tools that we presently have in terms of prevailing setback and those other programs that we have. Ms. Henson, could you help us there?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question in total, but I can say that we do have minimum lot size and minimum building line in the department, as well as lot side setbacks, for example, are currently covered in the ordinance. And could you rephrase your question so that I can make sure that I'm addressing your point?
Yes, and I apologize. I actually pretty much stumbled through kind of trying to figure out how to articulate my thought there. What I really was going for was, how do we allow all of these things to be considered and reviewed by staff once you're in a conservation district, but not allow them to be a deal breaker for a project moving forward? So what natural mechanisms do you all have for a simple declaration of a variance when it comes to each of these items here?
I think I heard two different questions. If conservation districts are approved and we move forward and develop a program, we have talked about how that might work in terms of being a checklist of items. So an applicant could, for example, and I'm just going to use the list on the screen, say I would like minimum lot size and I want driveways, for example. And those would be the two items that would be covered under that particular district. When it comes to variances, I don't think we're far enough along to know how a variance would work. We would have to continue to look at the ordinance as it's structured and put forward, and then how variances might work.
Can we, in the kind of maybe in the beginning of the process, just allow kind of, I know this sometimes is where things go to die, but just essentially say staff review. Like the variance is a judgment call by staff, taking all the information in, just for the moment, so that it doesn't become cost prohibitive by just following it blindly, saying you have to do all of these things, no negotiation.
I think it varies by the type of item that's covered under the ordinance, and I see there's a member from the legal department on the call. If they're able to contribute to this discussion, that would be wonderful. But a part of what's
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
It's Kim Mickelson, but go ahead and finish your thought, and then I'm happy to chime in if I can help.
My last point was it really depends on the item, the ordinance, and the item that's being covered under the ordinance and what's applicable. I think there's not a one answer that covers all situations.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, and this is Kim. You know, what I've seen in some communities, maybe not necessarily in conservation districts, but in other types of land development applications, is that the ordinance makes a distinction between what is minor and what is major, and maybe minor ones are delegated to staff. The difficulty in a variance process is it is almost by definition subjective and based on individual facts. And if we call it that kind of a, if we imbue it into that kind of a structure, there's more discretion granted to the decision-making body, generally because of a public hearing, an opportunity to voice all sides on a matter. If we want to delegate things to staff, we have to make sure they are situations where we can clearly delegate the authority that's being given to them. You know, in these situations, if they meet 4 of the 5 conditions or something like that, that has to be a very clear delegation of power. So Lynn's right, a lot will depend once we get really to the details of maybe even each type of conservation district or each district individually. Does that help a little?
Yes, thank you. And I think that's actually probably your last statement is probably the essential one, is it really comes down to a conservation district, the individual circumstances that would form what those major and minor things are, and who should be, you know, ultimately making the decision, public or staff or a combination. So
Yep.
thank you.
If I may comment, this is Svidha Bande. All of these are like the menu items that somebody who's wanting to become a conservation district could choose from. What we still are yet to discuss is how the overlaps will be addressed, because some of these, as you can see, lot width, minimum building line or minimum lot size, we have some regulations already in place, some tools already in place to handle those. So if, let's say, district picks one of these, what is the next step? Do we require them to go through the minimum lot size process or minimum building line process, or do we have a simplified process? How do we want to handle the overlap is something the group has to still discuss.
Go ahead, Mr. Friedman, please.
Yeah, on the incentive side, I brought that up because I going through this early on, we had talked about the opportunity to possibly opt out. So if there was somebody in the community that decided they didn't want to be part of this conservation district, they could opt out. The problem with that then is it kind of loses some of its teeth. It doesn't have the real strength. But if we go in with very strict regulation on certain items that are kind of most likely would be stricter than what the policies in the city already are, then there's an opportunity to stifle new development, affordable housing. other items like that that could have an unintended consequence. And that was kind of my fear is if you want to do this right, it really there really shouldn't be an opt-out. If there's an opt-out, then it doesn't really have any strength to it. But if you do it with all these possible regulations or areas where we can be overly stronger than what the city already has in place, there is that possibility that it stifles development or at least makes the process much more difficult.
Could you elaborate? I mean, let's try to play it through an example, because I want to make sure that of course, because opting out, like when I think about adoption of the ordinance, adoption of, say, a future conservation district, and let's say it's one where somehow we've said it's 51% of the people have. So we've been using the word lots a lot, but in the preservation district, I mean, the ordinance for the preservation, we talk about tracts. So whether it's because if a single owner owns contiguous property, that's a tract. So if you had 10 tracts, let's say, and 51% of the tract owners would like to create a conservation district, then there's some people there, the other 49, whatever that number of lots, I guess it's 4 lots or something like that, they may not have the option to, quote, opt out, at least the way I'm thinking about this. And so could you speak to or talk about that a little bit more, Mr. Friedman, how you see that?
Sure. So we'll give you an example over here in the greater OST area. There are a lot of open parcels and lots in this area. And in those lots, there are a lot of old growth trees. Some of those trees are right in the center of the lots. It's really almost impossible to build around those. But if you have a bunch of houses that are already developed and people like those trees because they're great, they're almost like parks right now just because they're empty lots. If they made a conservation district at 51% and said you could not demo or remove any of these trees, then you basically have stopped any type of development. And if you don't have a variance for that, and that's kind of what we're talking about, we don't really have a variance process because each one is unique. You could definitely have issues there. And there's almost every one of these areas I can go through and think of how it could cause issues. Not saying it will, but it could. And I feel like at this point in the discussion, it's probably good to bring up those ideas because we don't want to get caught later on down the road, not really going down that path.
Absolutely. And so then, that may flush itself out in the adoption process and the notification process and the required transparency that we would want to have occurring, so that as it moves along, it doesn't, we don't cause that undue burden on the ability to, as they say, get the best use from the property. It's a balance, no doubt, right? It's a tremendous balance there, but I'm respectful of that concern. And I think it would have to be fleshed out in the adoption process of a tailor-made district that is that where you do try very hard to communicate with everybody who has an interest, so that, for example, in your case there, you don't say trees over a 1 foot diameter may not be removed, but maybe it's that, again, you've got to watch that language. So if trees over a certain diameter are removed, they'll be replaced with 3 trees of a 3-inch diameter, or whatever however you want to, if that, as an example, very tailor-made application.
I think that would be helpful. Again, the only concern would be some of these options of, okay, if you do this and you can do these other things, that adds cost to a project. And my specific concern is really affordable housing, and trying to build a product within side of 610 is a very expensive proposition right now. And any additional cost just scare me. So that when you hear me talking up, that's my point of view on this, because I'm really trying to be able to provide a product to my neighbors that is truly affordable, not just by under the medium house price in Houston, but an actual affordable house for somebody that is well under the 80% AMI.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis?
Yeah, and I spoke to that point earlier, and I agree with this 100%, that when you create conditions that might add cost to new development, the one way to mitigate that issue of adding costs would be to make funds available either through low to no interest loans or flat out grants, depending on the proponent, through a process of prioritization. So whether it's an annual review or whether it's a TERS budget allocation, let's say if it's in a TERS and you want to control fencing and landscaping, and the TERS can float a bond to create a fund to help fund those improvements, even if it's on a private property. It may be in the form of a forgivable loan or something like that. That might be one way of doing it. I think the question of maintaining character and facilitating development is a manageable one, but it generally requires some lubricant of money. And to the extent that the Conservation District Ordinance can have relationships legally or policy-wise to funding priorities, does make it complex, but it would be important, even if there was a conservation district fund that was established separately to begin to address this, so that all the city and county or whoever the authorities were looking at maintaining that fund, then the fund gets managed in order to mitigate these issues that are being discussed.
That's the way, and you mentioned when you said legal, I was like, but policy wise, I think that from what I've heard over the last couple of months, it's the policy wise potential that is the greatest. Because that, so that you can build those relationships with other programs in the city, like CDBG programs or a TERS that exists or something like that, in order to so that you have this boundaried area that you might utilize that tool in. Mr. Crawford, do you have any thoughts on this topic? I know you've been looking at this for a while, a little bit here and there.
I'm sort of just listening here. I think my focus has mainly been on trying to tailor our historic site exemption to the needs of preserving more than just architectural resources, but also cultural and economic resources. And so it's interesting to see how this idea fits in with it. But I don't, those concepts are kind of nebulous at this point. So what I'm really doing on this call is trying to see where you guys are coming from, what your goals are, and then hopefully making the two processes work together.
Yes. Yes, that makes well. It's the same area, because see, you're working with landmarks, or these, like the tax incentives we offer are for that particular type of designation. So there, of course, there is the potential policy policy implications of any designation, and this is just another one that can be. It is way more flexible than a historic district adoption. Mr. Davis?
Yeah, a good example is a Texas Main Streets program. When a community gets a Main Streets designation, it comes with it access to a whole host of state resources. There's a website for property sales and description that ties into the MLS. There are low interest loans that are available. The state has dedicated a certain portion of its historic preservation dollars for that. There's a historic tax credit prioritization for designation. So from I think that because we are talking about conservation districts as a public policy, right? That it would necessitate a consideration of public resources being made available to support this, because an individual property owner shouldn't have to bear the full burden of this, particularly when you have property owners of such varying degrees in terms of income, organization, all that kind of thing. So I think that looking at the models that are similar to the Main Streets program for the state of Texas is a good way to think about how these kinds of designations can get integrated with other public policy tools.
That's an excellent example. And they also offer the architectural services of the Texas Historic Commission are available to property owners in the Main Street program. So that, from a historic preservation point of view, is a great thing. And I relied on the Main Street program in Denton, Texas a lot, and I established the Main Street program in Brownsville, Texas. But in Denton, I would get a call, for example, from a historic building property owner who would approach us with some plans for a great two-story brick building on Main Street Square, but their plans were not very good initially. Maybe they didn't have an architect, or they didn't have one qualified to work on a historic building. And then I could immediately say to them, are you aware, because usually they're not, that all you have to do is submit your plans to the THC, and there's a 30-day turnaround, and they'll provide for you drawings for how to restore or rehabilitate this storefront in a way that works for you. So yeah, I think it's that, and we as a city, as we, God willing, grow the preservation effort here, this could be a tool that we use that way. So I think that we've only got about 15 minutes left, and that's done with the questions. I'm going to return back now to our agenda. If it's before you now, again, we completed number one. We reviewed the survey answers. I'd like to just, and this is some of what we've talked about in the last 2 or 3 meetings, or that we wanted to do. We were concerned. I'm going to go over these next 3 slides, or just some of those concerns. There were lots of changes in loss of character and impacts to character in certain neighborhoods. Growth on vacant lots, how to redevelop more intentionally and preserve character and assist in stewarding without zoning and without costly restrictions. And then we needed to have transparency, make sure that whatever the process is, and this can be a part of the adoption ordinance, that you, again, how you notify, be aware of the sense of the loss of community of people, affordability, traveling with deeds. We talked about like how that could be accomplished. That's a larger question, but it's about that affordability component. How to use, we talked about using land banks, again, about affordable housing, property tax incentives, locking in for other residents in the district. In other words, the right to purchase, how to reevaluate a district, sunset provisions. So what's the lifespan of something that gets created? How does the city make it financially irresponsible not to do appropriate work because the incentives are in place? And we had an important statement from someone about the trees and the protection of landscape and mature oaks and the easement. And then that's kind of one of the criteria we agree that we could protect. So with just 10 minutes left, I wanted to take a stab at kind of the narrative, the story behind what we've learned in the last several months, and I'm going to bring y'all back up so I can see because I can't see. There we are. So this is just absolutely draft language. This is something distinct. Could I get a few, maybe a few sentences from y'all? But I'm thinking that in the next meeting, we'd like to come back with a narrative with some points, some specifics that we can recommend to the larger Livable Places Committee. I'm hearing something like this, that the Conservation District Task Force recommends to the Livable Places Action Committee that the City of Houston adopt an ordinance allowing for the creation of conservation districts in Houston. That's maybe my opening, that's maybe what I would see as kind of the opening statement. And then, the purpose of these districts, and I think I say is here, but it really probably should be, may be, to protect historic resources, sites of remembrance or cultural heritage, these items. So we know actually now I can take this language here straight from what we agreed could be the criteria, if you will, if you'll allow me that privilege in the next draft of it. With respect to the incentives part of it, I think what I'm hearing from today's meeting is that we leave it as part of the narrative in our recommendation. We're saying we're aware that conservation districts might be used in policy decisions to help with affordability and with the protection of certain areas. So that's the policy language here. The flexibility of the tool. And I'm just, any thoughts about this? So again, what should this with this task force? I'm sorry, the focus group. This is where I think that we would head next. We've recorded this, of course, so we can go back and review it. And I have a sense from working with y'all over the last several months that there is a consensus here that we should allow the city of Houston to allow people to create conservation districts. And I think from the survey questions we have some guardrails, which we can put in here as points. Who could apply, what they could regulate, how large or small. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's really the main thing we want to put forward. But I'm definitely hearing that this narrative is critical because there's this passion for affordability, allowing for development to not be too impeded, but clearly respecting the cultural heritage of Houston, which is critically important. And allowing here a tool that's flexible for some neighborhoods which have seen, either through urban renewal, the eradication of their historic resources, but there's still a cultural identity with the neighborhood, or they're experiencing current pressure on those neighborhoods. But a tool that's flexible that someone might adopt to get guidance. And I think the key thing that we haven't mentioned here much, but I did sense from the National Trust that it should be staff recommending or approving of the work. What I have seen, and I know, I'm a native Houstonian, I know different parts of Houston, and there are these incredible historic resources spread out across our city. And sometimes they pop up for sale and they get in the wrong hands. To me, wrong hands, if it's a culturally significant or a building or an identity building, a gatekeeper building, if you will. You pull into certain neighborhoods and there are these resources that are there, old historic brick buildings, and then they're demolished. So I see this as opportunity for people to kind of band together to pass a tailor-made district. And I don't think we have to have every answer, but how do y'all feel? Would you be okay with us as staff continuing this language a little further and bringing these points back to you in the next meeting?
Yes, I'd like that. Zion speaking here.
I would agree. What might be additionally helpful is if you post this on a Google Docs page for the committee members, and maybe put in an example of what this language should be, and then leave space for people to just add different phrases by paragraph topic or something like that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Sure. Of course. Absolutely. We can do that. Absolutely. That's a perfect, great way to do it, or some tool where we're sharing like that. Mr. Friedman's concerns, you know, the incentive part of this I struggle with, but I think it's important that we at least move a step forward and say we can create these districts, that we could allow for the creation of these districts. That's important to remember. There's nothing we're not creating one now. We're just saying someone could come forward with one. And then if that process is transparent enough, it should hopefully protect the interests of people who want to build affordable housing. And then we just have to deal with making sure we're flexible enough that we don't overly impede it. As you said, I know there are very few land left in the inner city, and we need people to be able to live in the inner city for transportation purposes and for jobs, education. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts?
I think it's a great idea to move forward the narrative. And just kind of following up what Mr. Davis said, I think there are opportunities here for incentives. If there are, it's just really trying to define those and see if we can combine those to make them work with development. Whether it's giving better setback standards for somebody that's in a conservation district that's following these other type of improvements, or a forgivable loan, or whatever process it is. But I don't know if it needs to be in our narrative, but I do feel like bringing up the idea of using whatever means necessary to really to not stifle affordable housing or development is definitely a good statement, or something similar to be in there.
Great, thank you. We'll do that. I like the idea of maybe some paragraphs. We kind of lay out a couple, and then you could come in and try to refine that wording. We'll get that out, of course. We're early in this week. We should be able to get that out no later than, say, 2 weeks from now, not this Friday, but the next. And then we could give a week for people to respond and call the next meeting. And if that's okay with you, that could be the plan.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We're running right up against the 3 o'clock hour, and I thank you for your help and guidance and ideas. And we'll get going on it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm stopping the recording.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Good meeting, everybody. Thank you.